The morning sun cast long shadows across the bombed-out village of Karachi when Lieutenant Sarah received the urgent message. General had vanished during what should have been a routine inspection of the forward operating base. The last radio contact came at 3:47 hours, just minutes before the massive explosion that lit up the eastern horizon like a second sunrise. Sarah adjusted her rifle scope and studied the smoking ruins through her binoculars. 3 days had passed since the blast, and search teams had found nothing but debris and silence. The military brass had already begun whispering about memorial services and posthumous medals. But Sarah knew something they didn't. She had seen movement in the thermal imaging scans from her elevated position on the mountain ridge. The explosion had been catastrophic. Intelligence reports suggested insurgents had detonated a cache of stolen military explosives, turning the small outpost into a crater 40 feet deep. The official count listed 17 soldiers missing, presumed dead. General had been inspecting new defensive positions when the world erupted around him. Sarah had been on overwatch duty that night, positioned 2 kilometers away on a rocky outcropping that locals called Eagle's Nest. The blast wave had knocked her unconscious and buried her position under loose rocks and sand. When she finally dug herself out 6 hours later, her radio was dead, her backup communications were destroyed, and thick smoke blanketed the entire valley. For most soldiers, being cut off and alone would have meant retreating to the nearest base for extraction. But Sarah was not most soldiers. The daughter of immigrants who had fled war-torn Cambodia, she had learned early that survival meant making impossible choices. Her father had taught her to hunt in the mountains of Colorado, and her mother had shared stories of hiding in jungles for weeks with nothing but determination and rice. The military had recognized her talents quickly. Sarah could remain motionless for hours, read wind patterns like poetry, and make shots that other snipers considered impossible. Her record included confirmed eliminations at distances exceeding 1,200 meters, and her psychological profile noted an unusual ability to remain calm under extreme pressure. But this mission was different. This was personal. General had been the officer who had recommended her for sniper school when others said a woman couldn't handle the physical demands. He had stood up for her when senior officers questioned whether she belonged in special operations. More than that, he had become a mentor who understood that her quiet demeanor hid a fierce intelligence and unbreakable will. As Sarah packed her gear for the solo rescue mission, she her supplies with methodical precision. Her M24 sniper rifle was intact, despite the blast damage to her position. She had 47 rounds of ammunition, enough water for 3 days if she rationed carefully, and emergency rations that would last 4 days. Her night vision equipment had survived, along with her range finder and wind meter. The terrain between her current position and the blast site was treacherous. Rocky cliffs gave way to dense forest, which opened into exposed valleys where enemy patrols might be waiting. Intelligence suggested that insurgent groups had been monitoring military movements in the area for weeks, planning something significant. The explosion might have been the opening move in a larger offensive. Sarah had studied topographical maps of the region until she could navigate blindfolded. She knew every ridge, every creek bed, every cave system that honeycombed the limestone mountains. The local geology was her ally. Underground water sources meant she could survive longer than expected, and the complex cave networks provided concealment routes that would be invisible to aerial surveillance. The first challenge was getting down from Eagle's Nest without being detected. Sarah waited until late afternoon when the sun would be behind her, making her silhouette harder to spot from the valley below. She moved like her grandfather had taught her, placing each step deliberately, using natural cover, becoming part of the landscape rather than moving across it. Her descent took 4 hours. What should have been a 30-minute climb in daylight became an exercise in patience and precision. Every few minutes, Sarah stopped to scan the area through her scope, looking for signs of enemy movement. The valley appeared empty, but she had learned not to trust appearances. As darkness fell, Sarah reached the edge of what had once been forward operating Base Delta. The explosion had transformed familiar landmarks into an alien landscape of twisted metal and scattered concrete. Buildings that had housed 200 soldiers were now unrecognizable piles of rubble. The main communications tower lay on its side like a fallen giant, its steel framework bent into impossible shapes. Sarah established a temporary observation post in the ruins of what had been a supply depot. From this position, she could survey the entire blast area while remaining concealed. Her night vision equipment revealed details that daylight had hidden. Footprints in the soft earth, disturbed debris patterns, and drag marks that suggested someone had moved through the area after the explosion. The official search teams had focused on the most obvious locations, places where survivors might naturally seek shelter. But Sarah looked for the subtle signs that others had missed. A piece of torn fabric caught on a piece of rebar. Boot prints that were too large to belong to any of the missing soldiers. Most importantly, a trail of small stones arranged in a pattern that she recognized from survival training. General had been captured, not killed. Someone had taken him from the blast site, and they had been careful enough to avoid the main search efforts. Sarah felt a cold certainty settle in her stomach. This had not been a random attack. This had been a deliberate operation designed to eliminate or capture high-value targets. Sarah spent the night moving systematically through the ruins, documenting everything she found. Her military training had taught her to process crime scenes, to read the story that physical evidence told. The blast pattern suggested the explosives had been placed in specific locations to maximize casualties while leaving certain areas partially intact. Someone with engineering knowledge had planned this attack. By dawn, Sarah had pieced together a timeline of events. The explosion had occurred at 3:47, just as intelligence reports indicated. But the attack had been preceded by smaller detonations designed to drive personnel toward the main blast area. General had likely been in the command bunker when the primary charge exploded. The bunker's reinforced construction had partially contained the blast, creating a pocket where survival was possible. Sarah found evidence that at least 3 people had survived the initial explosion. Blood trails led away from the command bunker toward the forest. One trail belonged to someone who was wounded but mobile. The other 2 showed signs of being dragged or carried. The drag marks were consistent with someone unconscious or seriously injured. The most disturbing discovery was a series of vehicle tracks leading away from the blast site. The tire patterns matched those of military vehicles, but the tracks were too fresh to belong to the search teams. Someone had used stolen or captured military equipment to transport prisoners from the area. As the second day began, Sarah understood that she was no longer conducting a rescue mission. This was now a pursuit operation. General was alive, but he was in enemy hands, and with each passing hour, his captors were moving him farther from any possible rescue. Traditional military response would involve coordinating with intelligence assets, calling in air support, and deploying specialized rescue teams. But Sarah was alone, cut off from command, and operating on information that no one else possessed. She made the decision that would define the next 48 hours of her life. She would track the enemy vehicles, locate the prisoners, and attempt a solo rescue operation that violated every principle of military tactics. The trail led northwest, toward the mountain passes that marked the border with hostile territory. Sarah knew that once the prisoners crossed that border, they would disappear into a network of safe houses and underground facilities that intelligence agencies had been trying to map for years. She had perhaps 12 hours before General vanished forever. Sarah shouldered her pack, checked her weapons one final time, and began following the vehicle tracks into the wilderness. Behind her, the smoking ruins of forward operating Base Delta continued to smolder in the morning sun. Ahead lay mountains, enemies, and a general whose life depended on the skills of a sniper who had learned to survive when survival seemed impossible. The tracks were easy to follow at first. Heavy vehicles had left deep impressions in the soft earth near the blast site. But as the terrain grew more rocky, the trail became subtler. Sarah found herself reading the landscape like a book, interpreting scratches on rocks, crushed vegetation, and the occasional oil stain that marked her quarry's passage. Her military training had prepared her for many scenarios, but not for a solo pursuit operation through enemy territory. Every principle of tactical engagement emphasized the importance of backup, communication, and coordinated support. Sarah was violating all of these principles, operating entirely on intuition and determination. The sun climbed higher as Sarah made her way through increasingly difficult terrain. The vehicle tracks led through narrow valleys and across exposed ridges where she would be visible to anyone with binoculars. She was forced to move slowly, using every available piece of cover, stopping frequently to scan for signs of ambush or pursuit. By midday, Sarah had covered 8 kilometers and gained significant elevation. The tracks led consistently northwest, toward the border passes. More concerning, she had begun to see signs of organized activity. fresh campsites, communication equipment mounted on high peaks, and patrol routes that suggested a significant enemy presence in the area. Sarah was no longer tracking random insurgents who had gotten lucky with an explosive device. She was pursuing a well-organized military unit that had planned and executed a complex operation. General had been specifically targeted, and his capture was part of a larger strategy that she was only beginning to understand. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, Sarah reached a crucial decision point. The vehicle tracks split, with one set heading toward the main border crossing and another set disappearing into a maze of canyons and cliff faces. Traditional logic suggested following the main route toward the border, but Sarah's instincts told her that experienced operators would avoid the obvious path. She chose the canyon route, and within an hour she knew she had guessed correctly. The tracks led to a concealed staging area where vehicles had been hidden under camouflage netting. Fresh tire marks indicated that at least 2 trucks had departed recently, but in different directions. The enemy was splitting their prisoners, making rescue operations exponentially more difficult. Sarah established an observation post on a ridge overlooking the staging area and began the systematic process of reading the intelligence that careless enemies always left behind. Cigarette butts revealed the brands preferred by specific groups. Food wrappers indicated supply routes and logistical connections. Most importantly, she found communications equipment that had been hastily abandoned. The radio was still functional, and Sarah spent precious minutes scanning frequency ranges for enemy communications. What she heard confirmed her worst fears. General was alive, but he was being moved to a location designated only as Mountain Eagle. The communications referenced interrogation schedules and suggested that his captors needed information that only a general would possess. Sarah understood that time was now critical. General was not just a prisoner of war. He was a valuable intelligence asset whose knowledge could compromise ongoing military operations. His captors would use every available method to extract information from him, and military resistance to interrogation had limits that everyone understood but no one discussed. As darkness fell on her second day alone, Sarah made her final preparations for what she knew would be the most difficult phase of her mission. The communications intercepts had given her a general location for Mountain Eagle, and topographical analysis suggested it was probably a facility hidden in the cave systems of the eastern peaks. Sarah loaded her rifle with armor-piercing rounds and checked her night vision equipment one final time. Tomorrow would bring challenges that her training had prepared her for, but that she had never faced alone. She would have to locate a hidden enemy facility, assess its defenses, and attempt a rescue operation without backup or support. The mountain wind carried the scent of snow from higher elevations, reminding Sarah that weather would be another enemy in the hours to come. But she had survived the blast that had killed 17 soldiers, tracked her quarry through difficult terrain, and pieced together intelligence that no one else possessed. General was counting on her, even if he didn't know she was coming. Sarah settled into her sleeping bag for a few hours of rest before beginning the final phase of her mission. In the distance, the peaks of the border mountains stood silhouetted against stars that seemed close enough to touch. The third morning arrived with a bitter wind that cut through Sarah's tactical gear like ice. She had slept in 2-hour intervals, waking regularly to scan for threats and monitor radio frequencies. The enemy communications had continued throughout the night, revealing operational details that painted an increasingly complex picture. Mountain Eagle was not just a detention facility. The intercepted radio traffic suggested it was a major command center coordinating insurgent activities across the entire region. General had stumbled into something much larger than a simple terrorist cell. His capture was intended to provide intelligence about upcoming military operations, troop movements, and strategic planning that could compromise the safety of thousands of soldiers. Sarah began her ascent toward the eastern peaks before dawn, moving through terrain that tested every aspect of her survival training. The vehicle tracks had disappeared on the rocky slopes, forcing her to navigate by terrain analysis and communications intercepts. The radio chatter indicated that Mountain Eagle was accessible only through a narrow canyon that insurgents called Devil's Throat. The climb took her through zones of increasing elevation where oxygen levels dropped noticeably. Sarah's physical conditioning served her well, but she was forced to rest more frequently as the terrain became more demanding. Rocky ledges required technical climbing skills, and several sections could only be traversed by rappelling down cliff faces that dropped hundreds of feet into boulder-strewn valleys. Sarah had identified the general location of Devil's Throat. A narrow canyon cut through the mountain ridge like a knife wound, barely wide enough for vehicles to pass. The approach was naturally defensible, with observation posts commanding excellent views of anyone attempting to enter. Traditional military assault would require significant air support and specialized mountain warfare units. Sarah spent 3 hours in careful reconnaissance, identifying defensive positions and movement patterns. The insurgents had established a sophisticated security network that included observation posts on multiple peaks, communication relays that connected the facility to external networks, and patrol routes that would detect conventional infiltration attempts. The facility itself was hidden within a cave system that had been extensively modified. Sarah counted at least 12 separate entrances, most concealed behind natural rock formations or artificial camouflage. Vehicle tracks led into several caves, suggesting underground parking and supply areas. Most importantly, she observed regular movement of personnel between different cave entrances, indicating a complex underground network. Sarah's tactical assessment revealed both opportunities and challenges. The facility's remote location meant that reinforcements would take hours to arrive, but it also meant that extraction would be extremely difficult. The cave system provided excellent concealment for the defenders, but it also limited their mobility and created potential bottlenecks that a skilled operator could exploit. The key challenge was locating General within the complex. Sarah had identified what appeared to be the main command center based on communications activity and personnel movement, but prisoners could be held in any of dozens of possible locations. A systematic search would take days and would certainly trigger security responses that would end any possibility of successful rescue. Sarah's breakthrough came when she intercepted a radio communication that referenced the General's medical needs. The transmission indicated that General had sustained injuries during his capture and required regular medical attention. This information allowed Sarah to identify the most likely detention area by observing patterns of movement to and from specific cave entrances. The medical facility appeared to be located in a section of the cave system that had fewer guards but more sophisticated security measures. Sarah observed electronic surveillance equipment, motion sensors, and what appeared to be backup power systems that would maintain security even if the main power grid was compromised. As afternoon approached, Sarah began planning her infiltration approach. Traditional military doctrine would emphasize the importance of creating diversions, coordinating simultaneous attacks on multiple targets, and maintaining constant communication with support elements. Sarah had none of these advantages, but she possessed something that traditional military units often lacked: the ability to move undetected through terrain that others considered impassable. Sarah's plan was elegantly simple and extremely dangerous. She would approach the facility through a section of the cave system that appeared to be used primarily for storage and maintenance. Intelligence gathered through observation suggested that this area had minimal security presence during evening hours when most personnel would be focused on active operations. The approach required descending into a ravine that dropped nearly 300 feet below the main facility level. From there, Sarah would have to climb back up through a series of natural chimneys and artificial shafts that connected to the storage areas. The route was physically demanding and would take several hours, but it offered the possibility of reaching the detention area without triggering the main security systems. Sarah spent the remaining daylight hours in detailed preparation. She reconfigured her equipment load to minimize weight while maintaining essential capabilities. Her rifle was disassembled and secured to her pack in a configuration that would allow rapid reassembly. Extra ammunition was distributed throughout her gear to prevent loss if she was forced to abandon her pack. Her approach to the storage area began at sunset, when changing light conditions would mask movement and guard rotations would create brief security gaps. Sarah descended into the ravine using natural handholds and cracks in the rock face, moving slowly to avoid dislodging stones that might alert sentries above. The climb down took 2 hours and left Sarah's hands raw despite her gloves. The ravine bottom was a maze of fallen rocks and underground streams that created natural concealment, but also generated noise that had to be carefully managed. Sarah moved through this obstacle course with the patience of a hunter, testing each step before committing her full weight. The ascent through the natural chimney system was even more challenging. Sarah had to climb nearly 200 feet through narrow shafts where her shoulders barely fit. The rock was unstable in places, and she was forced to rely on climbing techniques learned during mountain warfare training. Several times, loose rocks cascaded down the shaft, and Sarah held her breath waiting for alarm calls that never came. Sarah emerged into the storage area shortly before midnight, exhausted but undetected. The cave system was larger and more complex than observation had suggested. Artificial lighting illuminated a network of tunnels that had been carved from living rock and reinforced with steel beams. The insurgents had created an underground facility that could house hundreds of people and coordinate operations across vast geographical areas. Moving through the facility required different skills than wilderness infiltration. Sarah had to avoid electronic surveillance while navigating corridors lined with supply caches, communications equipment, and sleeping areas. The sounds of generators and air circulation systems provided acoustic cover, but also meant that guards could approach without warning. Sarah's route to the detention area took her through sections of the facility that revealed the scope of the insurgent operation. She passed armories containing sophisticated weapons, communications centers with connections to international networks, and planning rooms covered with detailed maps of military installations. This was not a local terrorist cell, but a professional military organization with significant resources and strategic objectives. The detention area was located in the deepest part of the cave system, where natural rock formations provided additional security barriers. Sarah approached carefully, using her night vision equipment to identify security measures and guard positions. 2 guards maintained constant surveillance of the main corridor, but their attention was focused outward, toward approaches from the main facility areas. Sarah's infiltration of the detention area required patience and precise timing. She waited for 40 minutes, observing guard rotation patterns and identifying the brief windows when movement would be possible. When the opportunity came, she moved through shadows like liquid, covering 30 meters of corridor in complete silence. The prison cells were crude but effective. Steel bars had been installed across natural cave openings, creating secure detention areas that would be impossible to escape without tools. Sarah counted 6 occupied cells, but only one contained a prisoner whose profile matched General. He was alive but clearly injured, moving with the careful deliberation of someone managing significant pain. Sarah's rescue plan required eliminating the guards without triggering alarm systems that would bring reinforcements. She had identified communication protocols that suggested guards were required to check in regularly, meaning that any disruption would be detected quickly. The window for successful extraction was measured in minutes, not hours. Sarah positioned herself in a concealment point that provided clear lines of sight to both guard positions. Her rifle was equipped with a suppressor, but even suppressed gunfire in the enclosed cave environment would create distinctive acoustic signatures. She would have to eliminate both guards simultaneously to prevent either from raising an alarm. The shot presentation came when both guards moved into positions where ricochets and acoustic reflections would be minimized. Sarah's first round caught the nearest guard center mass, dropping him instantly. Her second shot, fired less than 2 seconds later, eliminated the second guard before he could react to his partner's collapse. Sarah moved immediately to the cell containing General, using lock picks to defeat the primitive locking mechanism. The General was conscious but disoriented, showing signs of concussion and what appeared to be broken ribs. He recognized Sarah but required several seconds to process the reality of her presence. General's condition complicated the extraction plan significantly. He could move under his own power, but slowly and with obvious pain. The route that Sarah had used to infiltrate the facility would be impossible for an injured man to traverse. They would have to find an alternative exit route that avoided the most technical climbing sections while remaining undetected. Sarah's solution was characteristically direct and dangerous. Rather than attempting to retreat through the facility's security zones, she would create a diversion that would draw defenders away from the main exit routes. The facility's ammunition storage area would provide an excellent target for creating chaos while providing cover for their escape. The movement to the ammunition storage area required supporting General through corridors where discovery would mean immediate engagement with overwhelming enemy forces. Sarah used her knowledge of the facility layout to avoid the main traffic routes. but they were forced to move slowly to accommodate the general's injuries. Sarah's improvised explosive device was constructed from materials found in the facility's own supply areas. Military explosives, timing devices, and incendiary materials were combined into a package that would create maximum destruction while providing sufficient delay for their escape. The device was positioned to trigger secondary explosions that would compromise the facility's structural integrity. Their escape route led through a natural cave opening that Sarah had identified during her reconnaissance. The opening was narrow and partially concealed, but it provided direct access to the external slope where they could begin their descent to safer terrain. The route required some technical climbing, but nothing that an injured but motivated general could not accomplish with assistance. Sarah set the timing device for a 12-minute delay and began moving toward the exit with General. They had covered half the distance to the natural opening when the facility's internal communication system began broadcasting alerts about the missing guards. Their window for undetected escape was closing rapidly. The explosion, when it came, exceeded Sarah's expectations. The facility's ammunition storage had apparently contained more explosives than her reconnaissance had identified. The blast wave traveled through the cave system like a shock wave, causing sections of the tunnel network to collapse and triggering secondary explosions throughout the complex. Sarah and General were thrown to the ground by the blast wave, but they were far enough from the epicenter to avoid serious injury. The explosion created exactly the chaos that Sarah had intended, but it also made their escape route more dangerous as rocks and debris continued to fall from the destabilized cave ceiling. Their emergence from the facility into the mountain air marked the beginning of the most dangerous phase of their escape. The explosion had certainly triggered emergency response procedures that would bring additional enemy forces to the area within hours. Sarah and General had to cover significant distance through difficult terrain while managing his injuries and avoiding pursuit. The descent from the facility location tested both of their limits. General's injuries made rapid movement impossible, but the approaching dawn would eliminate the concealment advantages that darkness provided. Sarah was forced to choose routes that balanced speed with the general's physical limitations, often supporting his weight during technical climbing sections. By sunrise, they had covered 3 kilometers from the facility and gained significant elevation advantage over potential pursuit forces. Sarah established a temporary rest position where General could recover while she assessed their tactical situation. Radio communications indicated massive confusion at the destroyed facility, but also confirmed that search teams were being organized to locate the escaped prisoners. Sarah knew that their escape was far from complete. They were still deep in enemy territory. General's injuries required medical attention that she could not provide, and their route to friendly lines would take them through areas where insurgent forces maintained active patrol networks. The most difficult part of their mission was still ahead of them. The general's condition was stable but concerning. In addition to his obvious injuries, he was showing signs of dehydration and exhaustion that suggested his captivity had involved systematic deprivation. Sarah shared her emergency rations and water, but she knew that his recovery would require more comprehensive medical treatment than field conditions allowed. Their route toward friendly territory required traversing the same mountain passes where Sarah had lost the original vehicle tracks. The terrain was challenging under ideal conditions, but carrying an injured man through enemy territory while avoiding pursuit would test every survival skill she possessed. Sarah began planning their movements with the methodical precision that had kept her alive through 3 days of solo operations. As the morning sun climbed higher, Sarah and General began their journey toward safety. Behind them, smoke continued to rise from the destroyed Mountain Eagle facility. Ahead lay mountains, enemies, and a race against time that would determine whether Sarah's extraordinary rescue mission would become a successful extraction or a tragic footnote to a larger military disaster. The 4th day began with the distant sound of helicopter rotors echoing through the mountain valleys. Sarah counted at least 3 aircraft, their search patterns indicating a systematic sweep of the area around the destroyed facility. General's condition had stabilized overnight, but he was moving more slowly than their tactical situation could accommodate. Sarah's assessment of their position revealed both opportunities and dangers. They had gained significant distance from the immediate search area, but they were still 15 kilometers from the nearest friendly outpost. The terrain between their current location and safety included two major ridge systems and several valleys where enemy patrols could easily intercept them. The helicopters represented the most immediate threat. Sarah's experience with aircraft recognition told her these were military-grade attack helicopters equipped with thermal imaging and sophisticated surveillance equipment. Moving during daylight would make them visible to aerial observation, but remaining stationary would allow ground pursuit teams to close the distance. Sarah made the tactical decision to continue moving, using terrain features to mask their thermal signatures while maintaining steady progress toward friendly lines. She identified a route that would keep them in deep valleys and heavy forest cover for most of the day, emerging onto exposed ridges only during brief periods when aircraft would be refueling or changing search areas. General's military experience proved valuable during the aerial evasion phase. Despite his injuries, he understood the capabilities of the aircraft searching for them and contributed tactical insights that improved their concealment techniques. His knowledge of enemy operational patterns helped Sarah time their movements to avoid the most dangerous exposure windows. The first major challenge came when they reached Falcon Ridge, an exposed knife edge that provided the only practical route between two valley systems. Crossing the ridge would require 40 minutes of movement across terrain where they would be visible to aircraft and ground observers. Sarah spent 2 hours studying aircraft patrol patterns before identifying a window when they could make the crossing. The helicopter pilots were following predictable search patterns that created brief gaps in their coverage. Sarah timed their ridge crossing to coincide with a rotation between aircraft, giving them approximately 20 minutes to traverse the most dangerous section. General pushed through his pain to maintain the pace required, understanding that their survival depended on precise timing. Their crossing was successful, but Sarah observed changes in the helicopter search patterns that suggested the enemy was adapting their tactics. Rather than systematic sweeps, the aircraft began focusing on specific terrain features where experienced operators might choose to hide. The insurgents were learning, making each subsequent movement more dangerous than the last. The descent into Pine Valley provided temporary relief from aerial observation, but it also brought them into an area where Sarah's reconnaissance had identified regular ground patrol activity. The valley contained a network of trails that insurgent forces used to move between different operational areas. Avoiding these routes, while maintaining progress toward friendly lines, required careful navigation and constant vigilance. Sarah's route planning took them through dense forest areas where thermal imaging would be less effective, but the thick vegetation also limited their ability to observe potential threats. They were forced to move slowly, stopping frequently to listen for signs of other movement in the area. General's breathing had become more labored, suggesting that his injuries were affecting his endurance more than he was admitting. The encounter with the enemy patrol came without warning. Sarah and General had taken shelter in a natural depression to rest when voices approached through the forest. Sarah counted at least 4 individuals moving in tactical formation, their conversation indicating they were part of an organized search effort. The patrol was moving directly toward their position. Sarah's tactical assessment revealed limited options. The patrol was too large to engage successfully without significant risk, and General's condition made rapid movement impossible. Their concealment position provided excellent cover, but only if they could remain completely motionless while the patrol passed within meters of their location. The patrol spent 15 minutes in the immediate area, conducting a systematic search of potential hiding spots. Sarah and General pressed themselves into the earth, using natural camouflage and absolute stillness to avoid detection. The closest insurgent passed within arm's reach of their position, but failed to notice their presence in the dense vegetation. After the patrol moved away, Sarah waited an additional 30 minutes before allowing any movement. The encounter had demonstrated that enemy search efforts were more thorough and better organized than she had anticipated. Their route to friendly lines would have to avoid all established trails and known patrol routes, significantly increasing the distance and difficulty of their journey. General's condition required medical attention that Sarah could not provide with her limited supplies. His breathing was becoming increasingly shallow, and she observed signs of internal bleeding that suggested his injuries were more serious than initially assessed. They needed to reach medical facilities soon, but the safest route would take another 2 days of difficult travel. Sarah's solution was characteristically aggressive. Rather than following the safest route, she would attempt to reach the nearest friendly outpost by taking a more direct path through high-risk terrain. The route would expose them to additional patrol activity, but it would reduce their travel time to approximately 18 hours if they could maintain a steady pace. The decision to take the direct route proved both wise and dangerous. Sarah's navigation brought them to within 8 kilometers of Outpost Charlie by late afternoon, but they encountered 3 additional enemy patrols during the final approach. Each contact required concealment and evasion that consumed precious time and energy that General could not afford to lose. Their closest call came when they stumbled into an insurgent observation post that had been established to monitor approaches to the friendly outpost. The position was occupied by 2 guards who were focused on scanning the obvious approach routes. Sarah and General had approached from an unexpected direction, but they were now trapped between the observation post and open ground that would expose them to additional security positions. Sarah's solution required the kind of precise shot that had made her reputation as a sniper. She eliminated both guards with carefully aimed fire that created minimal acoustic signature, but the action left them exposed in an area where the missing guards would be discovered quickly. They had perhaps 30 minutes before the insurgents realized their observation post had been compromised. The final approach to Outpost Charlie required crossing 800 meters of open ground while supporting an increasingly weakened General. Sarah used every available piece of terrain to provide concealment, but they were ultimately dependent on reaching friendly lines before enemy reinforcements could organize an effective pursuit. Their arrival at Outpost Charlie created immediate confusion among the defenders. Sarah and General appeared from a direction where no friendly forces were expected, in conditions that suggested they had been operating independently for an extended period. The sentries required several minutes to verify their identities and authorize their entry into the secure perimeter. General's immediate evacuation to medical facilities revealed the extent of his injuries and the severity of the intelligence compromise that his capture had represented. His debriefing provided critical information about insurgent capabilities, facility locations, and operational planning that allowed military intelligence to understand the scope of the threat they were facing. Sarah's rescue mission had succeeded beyond all reasonable expectations, but the larger implications of what she had discovered would reshape military operations throughout the region. The destroyed Mountain Eagle facility had been only one node in a network of insurgent installations that posed a significant threat to regional security and ongoing military operations. The military recognition of Sarah's achievement came in the form of commendations and decorations, but the personal satisfaction came from knowing that her mentor and friend had survived an ordeal that had been intended to extract critical military intelligence. General capture had been part of a larger intelligence operation that would have compromised the safety of thousands of soldiers. Sarah's debriefing sessions revealed the extent of the insurgent network and provided intelligence that led to subsequent operations against similar facilities throughout the mountain region. Her solo infiltration had not only rescued a valuable officer, but had also gathered intelligence that prevented larger attacks against military installations and personnel. The psychological impact of operating alone for 4 days in enemy territory while conducting a rescue mission under impossible conditions would take months to fully process. Sarah had demonstrated capabilities that exceeded all previous expectations and had established new standards for individual soldier performance under extreme conditions. General's recovery was slow but complete. His injuries healed, but the intelligence he provided about insurgent interrogation techniques and facility capabilities influenced military training and preparation procedures for years afterward. His experience as a prisoner had revealed vulnerabilities in existing protocols that required immediate attention and systematic improvement. The destruction of the Mountain Eagle facility disrupted insurgent operations throughout the region, but it also triggered security improvements that made similar operations more difficult. The insurgents learned from their losses and adapted their procedures to prevent future infiltrations. Sarah's success had been possible because of specific circumstances that would not be repeated. Military analysts who studied Sarah's mission identified numerous points where failure was more likely than success. Her survival of the initial blast, her successful tracking of enemy forces, her solo infiltration of a major facility, and her extraction of a wounded prisoner through enemy territory had each involved risks that should have resulted in mission failure and probable death. The official reports emphasized the importance of individual initiative, advanced training, and psychological resilience in extreme situations. Sarah's mission became a case study in military schools and influenced development of specialized training programs for similar scenarios. Her techniques were analyzed and incorporated into standard operating procedures for small unit operations. Sarah herself returned to active duty after a brief period of medical and psychological evaluation. Her experience had changed her perspective on military operations and individual capabilities, but it had also reinforced her commitment to the principles and relationships that made military service meaningful. Her rescue of General had been motivated by personal loyalty as much as professional duty. The broader strategic impact of Sarah's mission extended beyond the immediate rescue operation. The intelligence gathered during her infiltration provided the foundation for a comprehensive counterinsurgency campaign that neutralized the threat network that had been developing throughout the mountain region. Multiple facilities were identified and eliminated based on information she had collected. General's eventual return to command positions brought a deeper understanding of insurgent capabilities and strategies to military planning processes. His experience as a prisoner had provided insights into enemy psychology and operational methods that influenced tactical development and strategic planning. His survival had preserved knowledge that proved invaluable in subsequent operations. The relationship between Sarah and General evolved beyond the traditional mentor-student dynamic after their shared ordeal. Their experience in the mountains had created a bond based on mutual respect and shared survival that transcended normal military hierarchies. Both understood that their survival had depended on exceptional performance under impossible conditions. Sarah's reputation within the special operations community was permanently established by her solo rescue mission. Her name became associated with individual capability and determination that set new standards for what single soldiers could accomplish. Her techniques and methods were studied and emulated by subsequent generations of special operations personnel. The mountain region where Sarah had conducted her mission eventually became a symbol of individual heroism and military excellence. The peaks and valleys where she had tracked enemy forces, infiltrated secure facilities, and extracted a wounded prisoner were incorporated into training exercises and military education programs. Her route became a pilgrimage site for soldiers seeking to understand the limits of individual capability. Years later, as Sarah advanced through military ranks and took on leadership responsibilities of her own, she would often return to the lessons learned during those 4 days alone in enemy territory. The experience had taught her that survival often depended on making impossible choices with incomplete information, while maintaining focus on the fundamental mission of protecting the people who depended on her skills and determination. The mountains kept their secrets, but Sarah had proven that even the most carefully planned enemy operations could be disrupted by individual soldiers with the right training, equipment, and motivation. Her mission had saved one life, but the intelligence she gathered had protected thousands of others. In the end, that mathematical equation defined the true measure of her extraordinary achievement in the mountains where she had survived alone and found the missing general by dawn.